I first introduced Dr. Khaled. I'm honored to be here with him and thankful for his time. Today, we're going to be learning about a Christian view on human flourishing. So, with that being said, we'll jump into this after I introduce Dr. Khaled. So, Dr. Khaled is an associate professor of psychology here at Regent University. He also directs the research office here. He's a faculty affiliate for the Harvard Human Flourishing Project and directs our Abundant Life Flourishing research team at Regent University, which looks at a uniquely and distinctly Christian understanding of human flourishing. He also has multiple PhDs, so he's well accomplished here to talk with us today. So welcome, Dr. Kenneth.
Thank you. You're very generous with your introductions, but I appreciate you. Thank you.
Well, it's all true. So we're honored to be here with you. So you're welcome. All right, well, let's jump into it. So I think typically it's pretty helpful to start with definitions when we're doing really any type of work around these areas. What do we mean when we speak of flourishing? Specifically, a lot of people might think that this topic was really invented with Martin Seligman in 1998 during the advent of the positive psych movement, but has it been discussed before that? So really, what is it, and kind of what's the historical origins of this notion?
Thank you. I think it's kind of an interesting question, so I appreciate you, Danny. I'm also excited to be here to get to connect to our counseling department students in this way. So when it comes to flourishing, I think it's one of those buzzwords that you hear nowadays, even in the news media. And of course, sometimes people throw it around, sometimes without knowing what it means, sometimes using it as a way of referring to well-being, talking about a sense of self-actualization or so, but it's not necessarily what it means. But flourishing in itself, it's sort of takes a more holistic, multidimensional approach to thinking about human well-being. So it's sort of a state of, a holistic state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, including especially in relation to their broader environment or their broader context in which they live. And that is very important because if you have a good sense of subjective well-being, but your environment is not ultimately flourishing, or you're not the things around your environment, within your environment, does not allow, it's not good, the conditions within around you does not facilitate or enable flourishing. Ultimately, you're not flourishing. You might be having well-being, subjective well-being, but when your aspects of your life are good, but then your environment is not good, then that's not flourishing. And so flourishing in that sense, it's all encompassing. It's a state in which all aspects of our life is good in relation to our context, the context that we whether live or find ourselves. And so most oftentimes when we talk about flourishing, some would often tie it back to Martin Seligman, who had also been very influential, of course, no doubt, in his work on human flourishing. But ultimately, I think he's not the he kind of brought conversation around human flourishing alive. It's something that's been talked about for like thousands of years. Almost any philosopher, theologian that have kind of wrestled with anything that has to do with science have always asked question around what does it really mean for humans, for us to flourish, right? And Martin Seligman, I think what he did, given the fact that he was also the APA president, he tried to bring that conversation back to focus, right? Not as a philosophical topic, but to study it scientifically, which I think is very unique. And so this sort of advent of positive psychology led to what we have today, and the focus on human flourishing, and the focus also on strength-based approach to mental health, instead of taking a pathological approach, which has always been what has been the case. Especially if you study also psychology historically, you see that it also would have to do with the advent of physiology and emphasis on that, and even cognitive science and behaviorism. But focusing on the strength that we have within us, it's more of a powerful way of going back to ask a question around whether you like it, maybe value ethics. And also you could tie it back to the work of Aristotle as well, his notion of eudaimonia, which simply talks about, it kind of talks about living in accordance with the virtue and that we ought to have, and living in accordance to our purpose. Even theologians like Thomas Aquinas as well, and even St. Augustine also have talked about or touched on human flourishing in some sense in relation to having a divine purpose or a moral virtue. And so flourishing in itself has been examined before Seligman for years, right? In Greek philosophy, even within theological circles around the medieval period, the Dark Ages, there's always questions around virtue ethics and even different cultural understandings around what it means to actually flourish long before this contemporary scientific study itself.
Thanks for that answer. So just to kind of recap everything what I'm hearing is that in terms of contemporary modern psychology, Martin Seligman is credited with this understanding of human flourishing, although he did it as a response to psychology's focus on remediating deficits. And he said, hey, let's identify some strengths. But there's a rich historical theological context in which these topics have been discussed. And so this isn't really the advent of conversations around flourishing. It's just kind of applying an empirical approach to it.
Exactly. And studying it from a scientific lens. For example, Aristotle, if you look at the PAMA model that Seligman had introduced, the PAMA model, the P, I think, is for pleasure, the A is for activity. I think
There's engagement, relationship.
engagement, P, positive emotion. I think E is for engagement, R is for relationship, M is for meaning, and A is for achievement. And that's a Seligman model. And you contrast that with Aristotle's model as well. You see the relation. Aristotle rather talks about pleasure, activity, friendship, contemplation, and prosperity or success, right? And when you contrast these two things in parallel, you see that really saying the same thing. Aristotle might be using language that speaks to his time, but Seligman is using a language that speaks to his own time. And so you think about it, even the work of Tyler Vanderville, the director of the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard, kind of one of the things that he does was also to take that same multidimensional approach to human flourishing and introduce things like character and virtue as an important constructed dimension to which we can understand what or measure flourishing, right? And so he talks about, for example, happiness, life satisfaction. He talks about the health dimension, physical and mental health. He talks about character and virtue. He talks about meaning and purpose, close social relationship and financial stability. And when you look at this, it's all kind of similar to whether it's a Seligman's PAMA model or even the Aristotle's virtue ethics itself. But ultimately, this is not something new, right? If you look at the work of Thomas Aquinas, he's also talked about it in its own way as well. And so one of the things that's happened with the positive psychology movement is like a new way of studying this empirically, right? Using scientific evidence, psychological frameworks, right, to assess this constructs and ultimately ask questions around this long history old truths, right? What is that about them, right? That it's might be useful for the way that we think about health today, right? And a flourishing life.
That's really important because kind of what we're going to get into is breaking down the abundant life model in particular as a uniquely Christian worldview model for flourishing. But I'm picking up on a couple of things. The question is, what is health? What is flourishing? That is many way tradition or worldview dependent. And it's not this idea that we can extract out of a context and just pull out of thin air or create. Just arbitrarily. There has to be some sort of standard or understanding framework in which we understand health and flourishing. And one of the things that you had mentioned before we get into the particularities of each model, already established that this is not new. There's a rich history. But we want to first get into, before the model, is some of the perhaps assumptions of the contemporary positive psychology movement. And so one of them is what I heard you say is the differentiation between hedonic and eudaimonic well-being. And so I'd be interested to hear you talk about that in relation to what you said earlier about including the context. It seems to me hedonic would be well-being, just individual kind of this atomistic self-actualization apart from the context, where it seems to me as though perhaps the latter model of flourishing, the eudaimonic, would also include the context. So I'm wondering if you could kind of spell that out a little bit more and the differences between kind of the hedonic and eudaimonic.
Yeah. So, thank you. That's a good question. So, I think one of the things that the focus of Aristotle's model framework, it's the emphasis on eudaimonia, right? which is the eudaimonia, that perspective, it's emphasis on virtue ethics, right? Things like purpose, virtue, self-transcendence, and moving beyond mere pleasure, right? As signals or things that are indicative of a good life. The hedonic perspective, on the other hand, focuses on pleasure, right? Things like subjective well-being as well. Life satisfaction could also fall under that, if you will. Or maybe for some people, happiness is sort of an emotional positivity. And so this is like secular, sometimes it's non-Christian way of talking about well-being or health or flourishing, right? In fact, it's interesting. This morning I was teaching about one of the people that was the chief proponent of this hedonic perspective within the French tradition. And he was one of the philosophers. I can't remember his name right away. But interestingly, he died of overindulgence in food just because. And you could imagine, that kind of a person. I'm trying to remember his name either. But essentially, for someone like that, who for him, flourishing for him was essentially pursuing pleasure, right? Focusing on that. But also the other question that comes, especially this also falls under that secular lens. When you pursue pleasure or focus on subjective well-being, it's all about me. It's all about myself, right? Or thinking about life satisfaction, it's about my life being, or thinking about positivity as well. And that's one of the problem or the criticism that is often come within the happiness movement and study, that it's kind of a hedonic way of looking at well-being, right? Where you focus on yourself, what is good for you, right? What satisfies your life. And so there's this self-reciprocating, this idea of self-reciprocating self kind of comes into picture, because it kind of shows how flourishing now is not just self-contained, but really occurs in relationships with others and even with God, and which I think it's something that is different. And when you think about that self, the reciprocating self in itself, that goes beyond just you, that it unfolds within your relationship with God and others, you find that in a context, right? Which is why flourishing is not just about a state in which an aspect of your life is good, but it's a state in which an aspect of your life is good in relation to your context or your environment, right? In order for you to truly flourishing, there has to be an aspect of relationship with people within your context. Which is where the dimensions comes, and there has to be, and that relationship can be expressed through maybe your character and virtue, the way you carry yourself in that context, maybe in actual social relationships you have. And so those pointers are very important. On the other hand, also, I think this eudaimonic sense of well-being or flourishing kind of fits well with this idea of meaning and calling and moral excellence, rather than just emphasis on transient happiness. And this is where we kind of try to think about how, as Christians, what is different about us? What is our context? What is our Christian context? And how can we conceptualize Christian flourishing from our context? And again, another thing I wanted to add as well is that, especially when we talk about human flourishing as well, it's also about focusing on the values. It takes sort of a value orientation, right? Because your values, it's contingent on your context as well, right? So if we can focus on what we value, what do we value as Christians? What we value as Christians is context sensitive. It's sensitive to our context. And if we can focus on that, ultimately, what happens is that we're able to understand how the different things that we are drawn to or that we value, how that kind of helps us to understand what a flourishing life would look like. And I'm happy to talk about Christian flourishing, the model itself that we've been working on this past couple of months. Yeah.
Yeah, we're just about to jump in. So that's perfect. But just the idea is that you can't just extract, when we think of happiness, a lot of maybe the colloquial notions would be, as long as I have positive emotion. Just me. It's just positive emotion. And like, as long as I'm happy, subjectively, this transient, fleeting emotional state. But what you're getting at is that you actually have to situate your understanding of flourishing beyond just hedonic individual well-being to within a context. So including your communities, including your family, your friends, and then also there's other components. It's multidimensional. It's not just having positive emotion. There's other things like character and virtue and meaning, and in all of these different types of aspects that we're now about to jump into with the model. Is that an accurate view?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And so in that sense, it's about when we that secular sense kind of focuses on the self. But ultimately, for example, Christian flourishing transcends self-focused happiness, which I think is what the world kind of advocates for. And most people will focus on pursuing happiness. Nothing wrong with that. But in some contexts, the goal is not happiness. In some contexts, the goal is not to be satisfied with life. For some people, their value, that's not their value. In some even cultural contexts, the value itself or even the goal, it's ultimately to see community flourish. As the community is striving, everyone is striving. In fact, you could even see that in some African cultures where, during those days where they would, engage in ancestral worship or communal kind of worship, where if someone does something bad, it kind of boomerangs, and there's some kind of consequence. Either people start to get sick, and it's that idea that if one person is not okay, or if one person is lacking in virtue or character, it impacts the rest of us, right? And so that understanding becomes important. And so when we think about flourishing beyond just the individual, it allows us to see it as not just an individual thing, right? But it occurs within a context, in relationship with not just ourselves, but with others, and with the world around us. And in extension, also it could also, especially for us as Christians, also it occurs in relationship with God as well.
And for example, that would allow us to study multiple levels of flourishing too, not just the individual, also, for example, within a church context, the clergy or even the society at large. So the context. So we've talked a lot about this overly individualistic and hedonistic, or hedonic, whatever you'd like to refer to it as, secular sense in terms of the contemporary psychology movement of positive psychology. And we've talked about the rich history preceding the contemporary positive psychology that hasn't really always even been focused on this hedonic individualistic sense of kind of well-being. So now what we're going to move towards is getting into the Christian distinctly Christian understanding of flourishing. We've established a need for this Emic, insider, uniquely Christian understanding of flourishing to critique the positive psychology model. We've laid out the PERMA model, the positive relationships, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. Let's talk now about the uniquely Christian model. Tell me about that model in contrast to this PERMA model, for example.
Yeah, I think it's context sensitive, and what I simply mean by that is it pays attention to the Christian context, right? How does flourishing unfold within a Christian community, within a Christian life? How is it context sensitive? And there are two ways to study any social scientific topic, or two ways to study anything social scientifically. One is to take the ethical approach, like you mentioned, and the ethical approach is that universal approach that you're trying to apply a universal principles across cultures, which I think is what most of this models, the PAMA model, even Aristotle's virtue ethics, and even Vanderbilt's framework of flourishing have done, right? It takes that universal lens. But beyond that, it's important to be sensitive to cultures, or think about how does flourishing unfold within particular cultures, right? Or within particular contexts. And one of those contexts is the Christian context. And we can't ignore the Christian context because the Christian body is the largest religious body in the world. That is something significant, right? We're talking about almost 3 billion people on planet Earth. So that,
Right.
and by implication, that means that this is a very important context to focus on. And so so we could, on one hand, study Christian flourishing from an ethical approach, from an ethical lens. And what that means is using the universal measurements and tools that we have to kind of look at Christian aspects of Christian flourishing. And what that means is to look at think about happiness and life satisfaction. Assess happiness and life satisfaction using pre-existing tools in a Christian sample. Assess things like financial well-being, mental health, physical health, all those dimensions that was mentioned. Assess them in a Christian sample. Now, why that's okay, it doesn't really get to the heart of the context, because
Sure.
what it does is, for example, we are assessing happiness and life satisfaction. That ultimately is not a Christian value.
Right.
Theologically, we're not thought or um, the goal is not to be satisfied with life or to be happy with life. That's not the goal, right? But we need to start. But when we take in an Emic approach, the same thing with financial stewardship or financial well-being. The goal is not to be financially stable. We will be financially stable if we become good stewards. So it's all about flipping it and thinking about what does the context, how can we be sensitive to the Christian context? And one example could mean, for example, instead of talking about, and taking that Emic lens might mean, instead of talking about things like um, uh, happiness and life satisfaction. Maybe the compass, we need to flip it and start with contentment, because the Bible talks about contentment. Because if we're content with what we have, we will ultimately not only experience joy, not only experience the peace of the Lord, but also we'll be, happy by definition, if that's what you mean, always satisfied with life. But also it involves also thinking about how do we start to conceptualize Christian flourishing. And to
Right.
do that, I think the beginning point is the relationship with Christ, because I think that's the uniting force
Right.
of any Christian denomination. So probably any Christian denomination that tells you they don't believe in Christ, then it's not a Christian denomination. So if
Right.
Christ is the uniting force, maybe that's where we should start. Now, beyond that, what are some of the pillars? If you're in a relationship with Christ, what are some of the things that is expected of you? There are ways that we could go about conceptualizing that, but at least I would, a good way to start would be to emphasize the theological virtues, for example. And the theological virtues, I think in 1 Corinthians 13:13, faith, love, and hope,
Yeah.
right? And this becomes the key pillars of Christian flourishing, that when we have these three things due to our relationship with Jesus, that ultimately these three things will lead us to having a sense of contentment, which is a dimension of Christian flourishing, would help us to have better physical and mental health, will help us to have better character, will help us to have a sense of meaning in not just in our calling, but in all that we do in our walk with Christ and also in our walk in the world. But also it will help us to have good relationships. It will help us to be good stewards, right? And so you see how this three, we call it theological virtues, right? Faith, having trust in God's presence and providence, regardless of what's happening around you. Hope, confidence in God's promises, and future restoration. Love is self-giving orientation, which is the ultimate of all things that Christ wanted us to be. And if we embody these three things, these are the pillars of Christian flourishing that sets us up for flourishing life, ultimately.
Yeah.
And the life of abundance as well.
That makes so much sense. Thank you for that really insightful kind of framework there. I even see that reflected what we were just talking about in some of the current literature in terms of how we've talked about, current models of flourishing versus Christian model of flourishing. For example, if we think about gratitude, there's a lot of research about the impacts on the person that's grateful in terms of symptom reduction, in terms basically what does gratitude do for you in terms of reducing distress and all these, which is fine. It's fair, it's interesting stuff. It's good stuff. But what you're suggesting is that perhaps a uniquely and a distinctly Christian view of flourishing would also maybe focus on a different teleology or telos, a different outcome and different dependent variable, something like how does gratitude to God impact our communion with God? Because it's a different endpoint. It's not just what does this gratitude do for us? It's kind of in terms of increasing subjective happiness, for example. It's how do we actually focus on the good life in terms of a Christian understanding of it, which would be a communion with God.
Yeah. And really, think about it. How does gratitude, for example, how would that, if that increases love in us, right?
Right.
Um, it ultimately would also filter into other things in our faith with God, in God as well.
Mhm.
And by having these virtues and having this, we call it theological virtues, these three theological virtues, it ultimately allows us to experience a higher dimension of what a flourishing, abundant life would look like. And it's interesting you say something about teleology, and I think Christian flourishing in itself is still teleological in nature. And what
More about that. Yeah, more about that.
what that simply means is that the goal itself is it's not personal success, but participation in God's redemptive work. The Bible tells us in John 10:10 that Christ has come, and he has come that we may have life abundantly, right? And that sense, it's an invitation to the mission of God, that we are part of His redemptive work. And it's funny because in that context, Jesus was speaking to people that was facing adversity. There was Roman oppression. There was scarcity in the land. There was suppression, as you would imagine. The mental health of people would be in shambles. And in that same context, Christ invites the people, His people, God's people, to an abundant life, right? An abundant life, a life of spiritual richness. And that also, it's also tied to that invitation to participate in His redemptive work. And so I think that becomes very important, because when we understand this, a life of abundance is a life that starts with faith. It's a life of faith, but also it's a life of an enduring hope as well. But also, most importantly, it's a life of that soaks itself in love. And when I talk about love, I'm talking about loving self. I'm talking about loving God. I'm talking about loving God, others as well. And it's funny because in psychology, there's a triangle of love where love is about intimacy, passion, and commitment, right?
Yes, Sternberg.
Yes, yes. And so sometimes we talk about love as we focus on just the intimacy. I love you as a person, which is great, right? But the love itself, the relationship or the point of connection or the chemistry of that affection must be followed by a commensurate passion. And passion, by passion, I mean, passion can come in many ways. Passion can come alive in the way that you show up for people. Passion can come alive in the way that you part yourself for people. And ultimately, when you have passion, it can sustain the commitment, right? Most people don't get to the point of commitment. And so when we embody this, whether it's in our love for self, or in our love for God, or in our love for others, it ultimately gives out a self-giving orientation, right? Which ultimately, when we have that, we part ourselves for others, we become wounded healers. There's something about that is transformatory, right? That allows us in that moment to participate in God's redemptive work. And in doing that, that's where the flourishing life flows. So the first life of abundance is.
100%. Yeah. So, if increase of positive emotion happens, great, but that's really secondary to the primary goal of pushing into the abundant life, which would include faith, hope, and love. And so, I guess I'm thinking now for maybe listeners that might have this. I have this question. So, how does suffering factor into this? Because we've already established on the Christian conceptualization of flourishing, it's not just increasing positive emotion. At the same time, I know you're not saying that, just because you have faith, hope, and love, it doesn't mean you're going to have an easy life or some sort of like prosperity gospel view, that you're guaranteed health and wealth just because you believe in Jesus and have these theological virtues. In fact, suffering is very at home with the Christian tradition. So how would the abundant life model view suffering, and is there any sort of redemptive hope within the suffering?
Yeah. Now, there's something powerful about having hope. We could talk about it from a psychological lens, and there are two things happens. Psychologically, for most people, they have what is called agentic hope, agency, the hope agency. And essentially, it's where most people naturally would be more hopeful than other people. It's something that they have within them, it's a part of them. But also, there are those that might not be as much hopeful, right? Because of their circumstances, because of the place they find themselves in the world. And so, for them to be hopeful, they might need pathways of hope. And that's a second dimension aspect of hope. Pathways of hope is simply plugging into things or different pathways. It could be a church community, it could be a support group, plugging into things or pathways that can help facilitate your hope. Even though you might not be hopeful naturally in yourself, but by being a part of those things or by engaging in those things with those people, it helps to kind of propel your hope. Now, that being said, there's something about when we are in a relationship with Jesus and we are able to build this virtues of hope, love, and faith. And when we have that, it transforms the way that we see suffering, right? Now it plays hope in itself plays a role in how we conceptualize meaning in itself, because now in that sense, flourishing and therefore it's then found in our alignment with God's purpose. Because we know once we are in God's purpose, whatever that is going on around us, around our context doesn't matter, right? Because in this sense, it then transcends whatever personal achievement, because our life is grounded in a life of service and community. And that redemptive hope becomes powerful as well, of the life to come, becomes more powerful in the way we forge meaning in suffering, And also there's a contentment that comes with that, being hopeful as well. Because once you're rooted in hope and trusting God's sufficiency, regardless of what's happening, you are detached from the crisis around you, right? You are in the world, but you're not of the world ultimately. And that contentment and meaning component or dimension, I think, stems from that, that enduring hope that comes from being in a relationship with Christ. And you could also say the same thing about love and how that transforms the way you see relationship or even your character. You could even say the same thing about faith, which kind of connects to all the different dimensions in themselves. Your faith, for example, would get you to take care of your body, because the Bible says your body is the temple of the Lord, isn't it? And so it's about
the stewardship dimension you were talking about.
Yeah, in a sense, but also I think the health dimension also, that's a stewardship element there. The stewardship also, it's also how we, of course, take good use of our body. It fits into that, but also at the same time, also our finances or our talent, the things that God has endowed us with. And we know that when we do this, when we are good stewards because of our faith in God, when we're able to manage our resources, our time, our talents with gratitude, with responsibility, with generosity, because we are loving, because we are people of hope, because also that we have faith in God. When we do that, what do you think would happen? Ultimately, we would have financial well-being or material well-being, because we've managed our resources really well.
And even if there is a sense of financial struggle at times, there's still the idea of, in that, Christ is with us. He's walking with us. We're indwelled by the Holy Spirit. We're attached to the Holy Spirit. We have communion with the Holy Spirit. And we also have a true sense of a blessed hope to look forward to in terms of like theologians talk about eschatology of union with Christ for eternity, of what we're looking forward to. And what I've heard you say too is that we have a sense of God's purposes. There could be God's purposes might being served in and through our suffering. And so there's a meaning in suffering.
Right.
So all of these things are just beautiful reflections about how a Christian understanding of flourishing informs how we view suffering.
Exactly. And you could also, like, one of the things with the universal ethic, you could call it, maybe it's a secular model, I think, of human flourishing, is that there's the pathways of flourishing, right? Those pathways of flourishing are also related to the dimensions that Tyler Vanderbilt had mentioned. The pathways are things like work, religious communities, family, employment, and depending on the context that you are looking at, the pathways could be more as well, right, in different contexts. And so, but in the Christian context, the pathways are the pillars of Christian flourishing. It's not necessarily those. Those things are important, but ultimately it starts with that life. The foundation is the relationship with Christ, which then leads to these pillars, important pillars. Your relationship with Christ should ultimately lead you to a place where you're bearing fruit, which is why the Bible talk about the fruit of the Spirit. You're bearing fruit, and the fruit could be embodied in the virtues, in these three virtues, classical virtues, under which you can also find other things as well, that make up for them.
Great. As we conclude today, I'll have one final question, but just to kind of summarize everything. We've talked about these two different models, and we've talked about a contextual, worldview dependent understanding of flourishing beyond just hedonic happiness, but to a more robust sense of eudaimonia or flourishing, which could include contentment in suffering. It's grounded in faith, hope, and love in communion with Jesus. And there's different pillars too of the flourishing model that would kind of be corollaries, but an Emic corollaries to the PERMA model. Like we've talked about contentment and joy, we've talked about stewardship, we've talked about physical health. And so I guess where could people get just a description of the Emic model in terms of all of the pillar? I mean, we have faith, hope, and love as the theological virtues animating the pillars, but there are some distinct pillars too within this model. So where can people find that resource?
So, one of the things we've been doing the past 2 years now, I noticed that there's really no literature on Christian flourishing science, and I think part of the reason why God brought me to Region is also to develop that field in itself. And so coming here in November 2022 from Sydney, one of the first things that I did was to have a meeting with my friend Tyler Vanderville at Harvard, just a couple of months after I was here, just to think about how can we do something similar to what they're doing at the Human Flourishing Program, but with focus on Christian flourishing science. And so we've started that conversation, and that conversation led to us having our summer school last year, our first Christian flourishing summer school, where we had colleagues from Harvard, from Baylor, from Duke, from different universities coming as we were brainstorming on this. And in the process of doing this, we realized that Christian flourishing, it's not just one thing. There are domains of Christian flourishing. And one of those is that, like, for example, all the stuff I've talked about today, it just focusing on the individual domain of Christian flourishing, which focuses on the individual Christian, right? Individual Christian flourishing. But outside of that, there is the congregational domain, because if we're going to talk about Christian flourishing, it's not just about the individual Christian. We need to also think about the congregation as well. Is a congregation, or the congregation within which the Christians find themselves at a flourishing congregation. But also beyond that, if they are flourishing congregation, is there a larger community flourishing as well, right? And so it allowed us to start thinking about Christian flourishing from this unifying framework, right? That kind of helps us understand what it is. And again, it's also very interdisciplinary in nature as well, where, for example, the individual domain, psychologists can answer questions at that dimension, but also sociologists can also answer questions about the congregational domain. Public health experts and those interested in epidemiology could also look at the community level impact and domain as well. And so one of the exciting things, it's been 2 years in the making, but one of the things I believe that God has tasked me to do was to first edit a collection of work that would help inform what Christian flourishing is, and with support and help and with some colleagues. So we will be having the first ever issue on Christian flourishing science that kind of captures these three domains and the contributions. We're having contributions, for example, from different colleagues. The congregational domain, it's being tackled by a colleague at University of Coventry in the UK, Dr. Leslie Francis, who is one of the heavyweights within the congregational science space. The individual domain, I'm contributing a paper of our model, of our framework, of our abundant life framework that captures the individual domain, with also measurement. We also have assessment tool on how to assess this as well. In fact, we've even started empirical studies collecting data on this domain itself. Also, we have another paper that touches on the individual domain as well, from colleagues from Baylor, Biola University, and also University of Connecticut, Bristol Park, Elizabeth Hall. So I'm kind of excited about that. And their model of framework is still, we're saying the same thing, but theirs is more ethic in our approach, in a sense where they're measuring Christian flourishing from the lens of love, but focusing on the affective, behavioral, and cognitive dimensions, right? And it's very complementary with what we've done, which is more ethic in nature, I would say, focusing on aspects of the Christian life that are essentially useful for flourishing life. But this collection of work, also we have a contribution on clergy well-being by a colleague from Biola University, and also another on the community dimension by another colleague from Harvard. And all this will be coming out this summer in the Journal of Psychology and Christianity. So that will be the first ever collection on Christian flourishing science. And so anyone thinking about thinking about reading or teaching the content on this itself, I think that will be a very useful resource to have, and a good place to start. But also beyond that, I'm also working on a book for Baylor University Press on abundant life, and just unpacking that individual domain as well, and fleshing out the abundant life framework a bit more, given the fact that, of course, for journal papers, there's always a limit as to what you can write, right? But I'm excited about that. And so hopefully around June, July or so, we should have the special issue out. And once it's out, I think anyone within the Christian psychology space should, hopefully know about it, hopefully. Yeah.
So we've been honored to talk with Dr. Counter today. I mean, as you can see, some of this stuff is, I would say, fresh off the press, but it's not even technically published yet. So we're definitely delighted to get an insider scoop. He's very productive and working very hard on all of these interesting things here related to flourishing. Today, we've talked really about the individual domain. As you can see, there's multiple layers or levels of flourishing. To with the paper that's coming out, you'll be able to see kind of the corollaries to this secular contemporary psychology models on flourishing, with the unique pillars of faith, hope, and love, and this associated domains of individual Christian human flourishing there. Yeah. So the last thing would be to leave the audience with, obviously, in terms of flourishing, you can almost think about it in terms of sanctification and being more like Christ over time. And that's done through the indwelling Holy Spirit, making us more like Christ. But there's also sort of cooperation with the Holy Spirit in our sanctification to be more like Christ. So in terms of inculcating or fostering this flourishing, we've talked a lot about how flourishing is, in fact, relational. How would you or what would you say to the listeners here about how they could kind of apply some of these concepts in their daily life?
Um, one of the things that I think it was Tyler that had said this one time, and I thought it was a bit funny, but also very much true, would be it's sometimes it's good to kind of do a periodic self-assessment and just complete some of the items, and you'd be surprised, how the Holy Spirit might speak to you that you might be lacking in this one, right? This is what you need to work on. And sometimes they changes depending on what's happening with you and which stage of life that you are in. For example, for someone that might be in a period of development, professional development, maybe the stewardship is still what might be missing, that you're not maximizing your full potential, right? For someone that might be dealing with a dilapidating kind of illness, might be struggling with health, right? But overall, I also think that one of the other things also is when we think about Christian integration, it's important that we think about doing it as an integrative work as well, where we're integrating both psychology and theology in a scientifically rigorous manner. And I think part of that's very important also because part of the reason why I think a lot of work before now, there's been some writings or publication around Christian flourishing, but most of it hasn't. I'm not saying that my work is more rigorous than those of the other colleagues. That's not what I'm saying. But I do think that it's important that we think about how we do our work and sometimes take our time to develop scholarship. And this is not something that we started writing about yesterday. It's been 2 years. In fact, we wrote the first draft in about a year, and then we had to pause because there was conversations and developments happening and wanted to make sure that we're really capturing what we should capture, right? And so the other thing I think it's important to measure spiritual and theological constructs empirically. How we do that is important. Of course, there's challenge in terms of doing this as well because most of these are subjective experiences, and sometimes most Christians are not kind of used to. People are not used to data collection, for example, in churches, right? The other challenge that might also come in this process as we're thinking and reflecting on the topic itself, it's the problem of cultural, I guess, variability as well in the way that people express themselves, express their flourishing in a religious context. And so when we bear all those things in mind and when we think about this, I think there are ways we might need to engage what is the topic or the field itself with a sense of a bit of humility and understanding what God is saying in the moment and also being sensitive to the context as well. The practical steps would be probably the validated measures, which we're already in process of validating the items that we've developed, and thinking about how can we even validate the items across denominations as well, right? And even think about how different Christian traditions might conceptualize and live out flourishing. Now, we have an Emic approach to it, but that doesn't mean that across denominations that they would that's an interpretation of their flourishing. I'm hoping that it is, but I know that, for example, my colleague and I, we shared the items with our colleagues in Germany, and they seem to like the universal ethic measure, the items, than the emic approach that we took in our work, simply because maybe in our work we were emphasizing Christ and all that, and they didn't really like it as much, even though they're Christians. Again, speaking to their secular context as well, right? So being aware of all those things it's important. But I think it's a field that is meant to stay, and hopefully that with God's blessings, that there will be some fruitful work that would come out of this that would hopefully transform the church. And the reason why we do this is not so much to just do research for doing research, but truly to empower the church, so that if we can provide data to show that what we're doing works, I think that's sufficient preaching, I think. And that it's a tool of empowerment for preachers to just do what they're doing, there's value and meaning in helping people build faith, in helping people have build character that would allow them to love, and even in helping people also, cultivate hope as well. That distance really matter, I think.
Right. Well, we talked a lot about good research directions and challenges. Practical application is examining yourself across those dimensions to see where the Lord might be working on you and getting plugged into the Christian community. So thank you, Dr. Conrad, for your time, and it's a pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, and thank you so much. I enjoyed, had fun doing this. Yeah.
Yeah, me too. All right, thank you.
Thank you.